Welcome everyone to the Spoken Nerd, the tech podcast about all things tech and all things database. I'm your host, Con McDonald, and it's a special podcast, the first for 2022. Thanks for joining us. It's special because I have a guest with my podcast today. Normally I do them solo, but a special guest today, I'll be talking to Nigel Bayliss. Welcome, Nigel.
Hi, Connor. Hi. Good to be here, I think.
That's right. That's what Tim Hall said when he joined my podcast.
Did he?
As well.
Yeah.
I seem to have established a reputation, but hopefully we'll both get through it unscathed. Now, for those that don't know, Nigel Bayliss, I'm sure most of the Oracle community do, but hopefully this podcast goes wider than that. He's the Optimizer product manager. I did some trawling on LinkedIn, and it says on LinkedIn, it says Nigel started at Oracle 19 years before I did. I've been at Oracle, I think, about 6 years now. So I think that adds up to about 25 years. Is that about right?
Yeah, that's right. I've lost track, really, if I'm honest, but I think that sounds about right. Yeah, I think I got a pen recently. So that's about right. You get a pen after 25 years or something like that. So, yeah.
Wow. One would hope it's a good pen.
It's a very nice pen, yes. Yeah, it is that, yeah. So I was quite pleased with it. But yeah, but in fact, I've been using Oracle since 1988. So that's an extremely long time. I always do remember that date.
1988. In fact, that's pretty. No, that's before me. I used to measure people's ages in the Oracle version number. So I was a late Oracle 5 baby, mainly Oracle 6. What was your vintage?
Yeah, mine was briefly 5, then 6. Yeah, so I do remember 5 and then being quite shocked at the differences that arrived with 6. But yeah, I do remember that. Of course, I don't remember any of it now. Yeah, the truth is I might have been using it for a very long time, but of course I don't remember all of that now. It's the first in, first out now with my head. So it's maybe 2 weeks worth of information, I think, generally now. But yeah.
Well, I have to admit the volume of stuff you need to know about just Oracle database nowadays is just insane. Like
it is.
The good old days of select, update, delete, and two-char to handle the dates is pretty much gone.
Yeah, I must admit, my first impression of SQL is that it was for babies because my background was assembler language and what have you, and C, and being exposed to select was what is this thing? It seems too easy.
In fact, trawling through the LinkedIn, don't get me wrong, this is not a job interview. I'm not going to ask you, what are your goals? Where do you see yourself in 5 years? Or I won't do a Google thing, which is, using only table access full, how many marbles are there in this jar? Those kind of interviews. I saw on the LinkedIn, it said, on the earliest sort of parts of job history, it said SQL Forms reports C and Fortran.
Right, yeah.
Do you miss those days? Like now that our new language comes out every single few months?
Do I miss them? Possibly, yeah. I mean, I must admit, my life in development was slightly frustrating because I never really got to do what I thought I wanted to do. So a lot of it was things like forms and RPT, RPF, or whatever it was called. And it always felt a bit high level, believe it or not, because I liked being in the C and down, really, is the truth. But I miss it because there was a lot of camaraderie back then, in those kind of jobs. There's a room full of us working pretty long hours quite often, and that never really bothered me because I was having fun, I have to admit, and I like the banter in the office with all the people there, and I do miss that. Yeah, it was a lot of fun, but it was quite a lot of it was mundane. Sometimes there was a lot of copy and pasting rather than creating. Development can sometimes slip into that mode, I think, where you kind of copy and paste a lot and you don't create. But when you're creating and you're there with lots of people, wow, that's great fun. And I do miss that for sure. Yeah, it's brilliant.
I have to admit, one of the things, I've worked from home ever since I joined Oracle, but it's funny how even though nothing's changed about my working environment, the COVID situation sort of makes it feel like more isolating, which is weird because it hasn't changed my work life in any way. But one of the things when I first started at Oracle and working from home, first 3 months, I really struggled with that concept of not being in a room with a bunch of people. Especially I'd come from a job which was very much, that was going the whole agile way. So there was the daily stand-up and the after-lunch stand-up and the post-evening stand-up, and groups sat together such that when bugs were found, someone would ring a bell. And there's all these sort of what I thought were gimmicks because I was one of the mature, well, I should say the older people in that teams. But yeah, like that was one of the things I did miss when I joined Oracle. And funny how COVID seems to reinforce that, even though it hasn't really changed my working life really as much.
I mean, I think for me, purely selfishly, it made things a little bit easier because I do work from home, and because we're all in the same boat, I found that people were slightly more willing to have conversations that were outside the scope of a fixed meeting, if you see what I mean. So it was not, for me, it was quite good because I gave me the opportunity to be disruptive like I am when I'm in an office and just have chats with people to some extent anyway. So it did make things a little bit easier, oddly, for me. But yeah, so it's a tricky one, isn't it? Yeah.
So having touched on your background, I notice on Twitter, although your Twitter volume is not high, it's more quality rather than quantity. I notice your Twitter handle is VLDB.
B, with a B on the end, VLDBB.
Which obviously doesn't have any particular relationship to optimizers. Where does that handle come from?
It's because I don't remember when I created it, but my background sort of towards the sort of late 90s was all centered around a lot of benchmarking, proof of concepts, very large databases in general. And so that's what I did really. I just worked on, I felt, cutting edge stuff, things that were really as big as you can make them. And in fact, I worked on a proof of concept at the end of the 90s, which was really just when partitioning came in. And back then, the database was, I think, something like 35 terabytes in total, something like that, which back then was really big.
That's a big database, yeah.
Yeah. So I've always been, I was always proud of that because I used to love it. And so I generally kind of labeled myself, I suppose, as a very large database expert. But I also felt I like high transaction rate systems as well. I like stuff that was difficult to do, if I'm honest. And the truth is as well, I didn't give my handle really a moment's thought. I just thought very large database, that's taken. So I thought very large database Bayliss, I'll have that then. And that was the extent of it. It was literally in seconds. I just popped it in because I didn't really have any vision about how I would use it at all. And as well, I think when I created it, I was probably in development, but I was working as a data warehouse type PM in the data warehousing and big data group. So, it all kind of made sense back then.
I have to admit, nowadays we'd get our brand ambassador in and the brand, publicist in, and they'd go through it and they'd do A/B testing on the likelihood of people remembering the handle and all that kind of nonsense. It's a bit of a different world when it comes to Twitter handles and stuff. So if your background was very large databases and proof of concepts, where did the switch come to being involved with the optimizer? Because that seems, I suppose the bigger the database, the more challenging the SQL performance and plans, etc. Is that what led to the switch? Or
I think now I don't really know the history of it, but it seems to be the case that the optimizer PM, certainly from myriad, of course, sat in that particular group, the data warehouse and big data group. And I think that's largely a function of the fact queries are much more difficult in those environments. At least they should be, so I think optimizer PM just sat in that tree within development. And then Maria went off for in memory, and then Tom Kite, I think, went on sabbatical. So we were in need. And in fact, it was 12.2 was coming up. And so we needed someone, of course, to look after all those aspects, particularly even, the internal things that PM has to do. And we needed someone to do that. So my boss asked me, do I want to do it? I said, yeah, okay. And so I did it. And I didn't really know what it would entail, if I'm honest. And part of it is how you mold it, I guess. So that I would say I just took it because I thought it would be interesting. And it took me, I think, maybe 2 years to stop being terrified of it, if I'm really honest. I think fairly early on, I had a panel at UKOUG, and I still have nightmares about that because I didn't really know about it, so much. I mean, I spent my whole career avoiding having to know what the optimizer does, because that's the point, really. It's meant to do everything for you. You're not really meant to have to worry about what it actually does, is the truth.
And I can imagine if it's UKOG, one of those panels, you can imagine there'd be Jonathan and all the various optimizer brains trust floating around, all with their and here's a particular niche case I'd like to raise right now. It's like,
yeah, I mean, you can imagine being faced by Jonathan Lewis and maybe Neil Chandler and some others, Chris Antonini, or looking at you, think, oh my goodness, because these people know a great deal, obviously, so it is quite intimidating. And I do remember Jonathan basically saying something along the lines of, well, you would say that because you're a corporate shill, or something, not quite those words, but that's why he said, I thought, oh, this is going well. And I've mentioned that to him since. I think he said, "Oh, we kind of laughed about it. It's quite funny, really."
To me, yeah, it is good to have fun having some back and forth with Jonathan. I mean, it's funny. He's one of those few people that, and if Jonathan, if you're listening, with all due respect, I like the fact that he says he's retired and he's probably been more active on Twitter and blogging in technical terms than he's ever been, if anything.
So. I know, I have noticed. That's not gone unnoticed. It's true. That's right. But I think over the years, you get exposed to so much and so many things. And I must admit, I thought I'll never remember any of this. And I used to create a lot of mind maps and things to try and remember how things would hold together. And actually, after a while, things start to become, I don't know, you just sort of fit into the groove and you remember this stuff and how things interact. Although, truth is, I'm constantly surprised. There are all sorts of things that happen. I mean, it's in the code's old, a lot of it, it's a lot of the core. The truth is I can't know, and I've become more relaxed with what I can and can't know now.
It is such a funny thing. Like my first experience with any kind of optimizer was actually with DB2. And it's funny, on DB2 on the mainframe, you just accepted the fact that the optimizer was correct because the only thing it gave you was the cost. And even that, it was simply saying, I'm now running your query and this is its cost.
Right.
That was the only insight you had into what the optimizer really was doing in these early versions when I was using DB2 back in, was probably the 90s. And it's funny how because of that, you never question the optimizer because you were never given, like, it was just simply like, I'm running it the best I can. That's it. It's almost like we shot ourselves in the foot by saying, look, here's an execution plan. Here's the sort of the series of costing operations that have gone on. It's almost like we gave ourselves enough rope to hang ourselves with because you're giving people clues as to how it came up with those decisions.
I agree, actually. That is a good point. And any optimization cannot cover everything. It's always a subset of what is possible. And I guess what I face quite often are people saying that it works in this case, but not in this one. And you think we haven't done that yet sometimes. And I think, as you expose the sort of wheels more, you can see where there's a cog missing, if I can put it like that. But, no software solution is fully comprehensive. It can't be, not something like an optimizer anyway. You have to sort of tackle the biggest bang for the buck, and you're balancing the cost of development against fitting with customer use cases and delivering those as well as we can. It's a huge balancing act.
I almost take it further. Even if we had an infinite number of resources, let's say Oracle went out and got themselves 10,000 optimizer developers, I think by definition the optimizer can never be perfect because there's an infinite number of SQL statements that can be run, which means you need an infinite number of stats in advance. And even with that, you then need an infinite number of seconds of parsing time because to know in advance what every join condition based on the data coming in is going to result, effectively you need a histogram on every column, every pair of columns, every triplet of columns on every single table, and then the same for the join results. The number is infinite.
Yeah.
So to lead into your question, like your statement about it's a balancing act, where do you think the utopia is? Should we constantly be trying to hit more and more targets with the optimizer, or is it better to, and therefore run the risk of increasing the parse time, increasing the amount of stats that need to be gathered, or where do you think that the equilibrium or the utopia?
I mean, because parse time is always mitigated, luckily, by Moore's law to some extent. So that's a sort of perhaps a get out of jail free card. But I think we're driven by, if I'm honest, we're often driven by competition. Of course, we have to move forward and innovate all the time, otherwise it grows stale. And I know a lot of, I'll admit, when was I DBA briefly, I kind of was, but I always wanted everything to stay the same. I don't want it to change. So I absolutely 100% understand that point of view, but that's not possible in the real world. I think we have to move forward at all times. And the joke is really the only way, the best optimizer, or the one that would always work the best, is probably one that runs every single plan that's available, test how long they run, and then say this one. And then that's only good for now as well. It's not good for tomorrow. And then, it's not even possible to test every plan for a lot of queries either. So it's actually a a very hard problem. It's amazing it does such a good job. We have to try and remember that, I think. But we always have to move forward. I don't think we can stand still. I do think it's probably best to be cautious in a lot of ways, because there are infinitely many different types of queries, and we can never guess what a customer's going to do. And, I'm constantly shocked by the things customers do. And I'm not saying they're bad, but you look at them and go, I never expected that, or I would never have thought of even doing that. And when you're hit with that all the time, you think, how do we even manage coping? How do we even deal with that? It's amazing. It really is.
It was funny, cycling back to you said when you're working on large systems and they were some of the tougher queries. It's funny, my experience has actually been somewhat almost the opposite, in the sense that most of the data warehouses I've worked on, and this comes from the fact that I've often had a fair bit of say into how we've designed them. We've really embraced the concept of, we're going to petition the living daylights out of this and have as few indexes as possible. And most of the constraints would be not present. They'll be disable rely, so that the optimizer could use them, but they were not there. In terms of as a result of that, and this is, I'd love to say this was part of my own innovation, but it wasn't. It's generally something I picked up on from those real world performance videos that Andrew Holdsworth did back in the day, when they were showing how cool Exadata was, and therefore they were deliberately shifting the conversation toward fewer and fewer indexes. I found with a lot of data warehouses, we might not have had the best executions, but we had the most consistent and the most predictable plans, because there were just so few options for the optimizer. It was very much like, you're going to be doing a full table scan of all these things, or partitions thereof, but there's not a lot of scope there. It's pretty much just going to be, hash joining and anti-joining till the cows come home. This sounds weird to have a favorite kind of execution path. But I've always had a soft spot in my heart for hash joins. It's like I always found them to be the best thing.
Yeah, they are, aren't they? Let's face it. Yeah, they kind of read and off you go. It's very nice. Yeah, it's a difficult one, because I suppose if I think about it, you've got this combination that you see quite often, where you have a database that is there, is general purpose, and that's where it starts to get difficult. So I saw a lot of things that I guess you label as operational data stores, where they're big and they are actually transactional. They run business queries, and things change all the time. But certainly when I was in amongst things, you've got this sort of stretching of what a database could do. You wouldn't say I'd have a database for this and a database for that and a database for the other. And I think that's the way the industry moves, isn't it? It wants to kind of consolidate things. And I always like the idea of consolidating all my data in one place and then using it for lots of different things. Transactional reporting and decision support and so on. And once you're in that mode, things start to get complicated. So maybe that's what I have in mind, really. And maybe again, the history of where the optimizer PM sits is an accident of history. I don't really know, but I guess I've always thought, OLTP, for example, should be easy. Should be, because you indexes, simple where clauses and off you go. Should be, but as soon as you get into mixed mode, it starts getting complicated, and generally that means a lot of data, I suppose. Yeah, I know what you mean, because if you're in pure data warehouse type queries, if that's such a thing does exist, then my experience, because I was also in the Enterprise Technology Center for I think about 7 years, where we had Exadata machines to play with, 24/7 if we wanted to, which was massive fun.
Exactly.
And yeah, you could just throw anything at it. It was fantastic. It was a riot, actually, because customers brought in lots of very tricky workloads, and we would just throw it at the Exadata machine and off it would go. It was tremendous. And maybe that's why I always generally did have an easy path with the optimizer. For me, it always pretty much worked. If someone said, my query's not running very well, I would say, have you gathered stats? And the answer to that was normally, oh, no, not really. And then it would work. So, yeah, I don't know. Part of the issue for me is that as well, I'm a self-selecting human. People speak to me usually because they're having difficulty somewhere or other. And that normally means, of course, I get to see that all the time, rather than the tens of thousands of people out there that it just works for, and it never does anything that's vaguely unusual.
In fact, now that you bring that up, I'll shift track. You mentioned before that when you became the optimizer PM, it was a little bit like being thrown to the wolves, especially at that UKG panel. It always strikes me as odd that the optimizer provokes so much emotion, because if your database crashes, right, or even taking technology out of it, if I go down to the local cash machine, or ATM as we say here in Australia, and it says, it's currently out of service, I can't get some cash out, I'll swear a bit and whatever and stamp my feet. But it's not like I then race home and write a blog post about how much I hate my particular bank, or I don't go switch banks. Or bringing it back to tech, if the database crashes, people sort of go, that's a pain. But if the optimizer picks one wrong plan, people lose their minds. They absolutely go mental. Why do you think it provokes that much emotion in database applications?
Well, I've got probably two angles on that. My first angle is that I must admit I've never really understood that, because for me I just felt, well, how can it get it right all the time? When you look at this where clause, I don't know. I think as you get a broader perspective on it, you become more and more amazed it works so well, actually. But I've always had that sense of perspective with it. I've just thought, it can't be right all the time, and therefore I accept that. So I've never had that emotion with it. But I agree, a lot of people really do, and I find it really hard to understand. I'll give you that. I've struggled with why, and I actually think that the reason people do get emotional about it is more about why does it change. I think that's the thing that I think people are most disturbed by. And so this query used to work fine, but now you've broken it, and that of course feels like it's made a mistake.
It's like someone's taken something from you.
Yeah, that it's actually out to get you. And this thing that it used to know how to do, it's apparently suddenly forgotten, and now it's made a mistake. And I think that is the hard thing to come to terms with, because the reasons are software engineering reasons and they're valid reasons. But when it does get you like that, it can be frustrating, well, at least annoying, and more, your job's on the line as well, where you're running this system and you've got it in a good state, and now you've got a query that takes a lot longer than it's ever taken before. And yeah, you want to blame the optimizer. You do. I think that's what it is. And so I kind of understand that. But as I say, the reasons for that are understandable, but it's getting to grips with that and understanding why it can happen, how it happens, and what you can do about it. Yeah.
So we got first rows, all rows, but out to get you mode, that comes in 25C. That's
the thing, But yeah, I do get emails where people are really, really upset because, as I say, question you always ask is, why has my plan changed? What is that? And that, of course, that's a really hard question to answer. But very often you look at the query and you can see that, in fact, estimating the cardinality for a lot of queries is incredibly difficult. And if you don't use something like dynamic sampling or what have you, then it's going to move further and further away from an accurate cardinality. And sometimes, I never normally say this, but there's an element of luck here, where if you get a query that's hard to estimate, you may be lucky that estimate happens to give you a plan that's fine at the beginning, but later on it might not. So it's tricky.
And I had to admit, I certainly take your point. I hadn't really thought that through, in terms of there may actually be people whose their job or their remuneration or their bonus, etc., is hooked into system performance, and therefore the optimizer might be something that they do have strong emotions to, because it's strongly attached to their job performance or how they're rated on their job performance. And on that note, the recognition that the optimizer can indeed impact the emotional state of the DBA because of the relationship to their job performance or job rating. We'll wrap up this podcast episode, but continue that conversation with Nigel in the next episode. We'll see you then. Thanks for listening to this podcast. The music credit goes to Zanman from Pixabay Music.